let's look then at what it really means to share power in the European Union. Sovereignty is about control, as politics is about power. However, in democracies, power is shared and constrained in many different ways that we might not always appreciate at first glance. For instance, a government can be a coalition of different parties sharing power. That's perfectly normal. Moreover, specific responsibilities are often delegated from a government to an independent body, such as a central bank, when it comes, for example, to banking supervision or monetary policy. On top of that, policies have to take account of the rule of law or of a constitution. Parliaments and governments cannot just use their democratic mandate to do as they please. So in this respect, the EU system is no different. But don't worry, I'm not going to give a lecture on the EU political system, as otherwise we'd literally be here all day. My focus really is on what it actually means for the UK to share control over certain policy fields within the EU. And here's a simplified rendering of how legislation is produced in Brussels through the interplay of three key institutions: the European Commission, the EU Council, the European Parliament. In the EU, laws are proposed by the European Commission, which acts independently of national governments. These laws then get voted on by two decision-making bodies: the EU Council, where UK ministers sit alongside representatives of all other countries, and then there's also the European Parliament, which has a contingent of 73 UK MEPs out of a total of 751. So let's examine how UK influence can be measured in these two institutions. What we have here is a figure from a report by the independent think tank VoteWatch Europe. What they looked at was the record of how ministers from each country vote in the EU Council. And they've looked at how often a member state was in the minority in the period between 2004 and 2015. And here's then an image looking specifically at that period between 2009 and 2015. What does it show? It shows that the UK is the country most often in the losing position when the Council votes on an EU law proposed by the European Commission. So roughly 12% of the time, the UK has to accept a law it does not specifically approve of. That's the country right on the left of this image in red, and it has a much higher number then compared with the second most outvoted country, which is Austria. The possibility of being outvoted, though, is inherent in any parliamentary system. Even governments that control a majority of representatives in Parliament do not get their own way all the time. However, it's pretty uncommon for international organizations to work on this basis. That's what makes the EU rather different from other regional organizations, such as NATO or the African Union. But of course, we can also look at the data from a different perspective, to think that actually what this means is that the vast majority of the time, nearly 9 times out of 10, UK ministers actually agree with their colleagues in the EU Council on what position to take regarding a law proposed by the European Commission. Please note, though, that there's a small set of policy areas where decisions in this particular institution are taken by unanimity. So that's what I like to explain now. For these matters then, as shown in this list, which comes from the EU's own website, no country can be outvoted, because in each of these areas, every country has a veto that can be used to prevent an agreement. This applies, if you look down on this list, notably to taxation and foreign policy, precisely because they are considered too sensitive to allow for the possibility of national governments getting outvoted. So the problem of getting outvoted cannot apply in these particular areas. But remember, voting in the European Parliament also matters, because it gets to have its say on legislative proposals by the Commission. So let's look at the data on where the UK's influence stands in this particular institution. So what we have here are data on the European Parliament, again taken from the report on Brexit prepared by VoteWatch Europe. What this image shows is that compared with their counterparts from other countries, if you consider British MEPs as a national grouping, then they're the ones most likely to be in the losing minority when the European Parliament votes. That's true at least since 2009. So if you go on this figure to the bottom, where the United Kingdom is represented, and look for a red square and a green rhombus, which hover at around the 65% mark, that will tell you that 35% of the time in the period 2009 to 2015, British MEPs as a bloc have been on the losing side when the EP has voted. Bear in mind, though, that MEPs represent political parties, not countries. They belong to party groups consisting of MEPs from various countries, and they vote as a bloc representing party ideology. So the purpose of the European Parliament is not to represent national interests. That is the job of ministers in the EU Council. Nevertheless, I think what we've seen from the voting data in the European Parliament, and in particular the EU Council, it suggests that the UK does seem to stand out from the crowd. And in fact, the Remain campaign is very aware of this sense of British separateness, and that's closely associated with the idea of not wishing to relinquish sovereignty because somehow Britain is different and should be ruled differently. To address that concern, the government's official leaflet recommending a vote to stay in the EU highlights what it calls the special status that the UK has within the EU in order to reassure voters that that separateness can continue. So that's what I'll turn to next.